At exactly 9 a.m., the room was silent. The kind of silence that presses down on every breath, heavy with anticipation and unspoken consequences. A long conference table stretched across the center, its polished surface reflecting the cold daylight filtering through the blinds. Around it sat a handful of sharply dressed lawyers, their faces unreadable, eyes fixed on the man at the head of the table. The gangster boss, once a titan who commanded fear and respect with a mere glance, was now a figure reduced to stillness. His fingers hovered above a pen resting on a stack of documents that, once signed, would dismantle everything he had built. Control, influence, and years of calculated power, all poised to vanish with a single stroke. The air in the room was thick with tension and inevitability. No gunshots, no shouting matches, no last-minute rescues. Just the quiet ticking of a clock counting down to an irreversible moment. This wasn't a story about violence or dramatic reversals. Instead, it was a story about the quiet death of an empire, orchestrated through paperwork and the cold precision of law. The gangster's empire, once sprawling and untouchable, was about to be erased by something as simple and final as ink on paper. The lawyers were meticulous. Every clause appeared flawless, every signature line perfectly aligned. The documents had been crafted with surgical precision to ensure one outcome: bankruptcy. The collapse was not just probable. It seemed inevitable. To the untrained eye, this was a straightforward legal proceeding, the natural consequence of years of missteps and mounting debts. But beneath this veneer of legality, something else was at play, a trap carefully woven into the fabric of the contract. No one in the room noticed the small detail, the subtle irregularity that didn't belong. It was a whisper in the chaos, a shadow hidden in plain sight. Every professional present, from the seasoned lawyers to the gangster himself, failed to see it. Yet this tiny anomaly held the key to a secret betrayal, a hidden force guiding the downfall not by brute strength but by silence and trust in systems designed to seem legitimate. The man at the table was about to sign away not just his assets but his legacy. He was about to destroy himself, led unwittingly into ruin by those he trusted most. But just as the pen was poised to meet paper, someone unseen looked twice. That single act of observation, overlooked and dismissed by all others, would alter the fate of an empire. The true power in this moment was not authority or intimidation, but the quiet vigilance of a solitary observer. Proof that the greatest collapses sometimes begin with the smallest, most overlooked details. How often do we assume that the loudest voice in the room holds the truth, or that the person at the top sees everything worth seeing? In spaces governed by hierarchy and routine, crucial details slip through cracks not because they are hidden, but because no one expects to find anything there. The quiet observer, the one who notices what others dismiss, holds a different kind of power, one that rarely attracts attention until it's too late. Consider how many mistakes, how many betrayals, begin not with overt violence or dramatic confrontation, but within the silent shuffle of paperwork, the unchecked signatures, the ignored footnotes. These are the shadows where intent and consequence blur, where the most dangerous crimes might unfold far from the spotlight, hidden in plain sight. Pause and reflect. In today's world, could it be that the deadliest acts are committed less with weapons and more with ink? Where the greatest damage is done not through force, but through the quiet erosion of trust and truth, facilitated by those who assume their role is too small to matter. What do you think? Are the most dangerous threats the ones we can see, or the ones we overlook because they don't fit the narrative of power and violence? Share your thoughts below. Does the pen wield more harm than the sword in the shadows of our institutions? He was never the type to rely on a gun barrel to command respect. His authority wasn't forged in the blaze of violence but in the cold, calculated realm of influence, shaping outcomes before anyone realized the game had even begun. The room where he once held court wasn't dominated by the thunder of threats or the crack of gunfire. It was ruled by the subtle pressure of leverage, the unspoken understanding that crossing him meant losing more than just money. It meant losing everything. He was a man who understood that true power thrives not in chaos, but in control. From the very beginning, he built his empire on alliances that others dismissed as fragile or transient. but he saw beyond the surface. Every handshake, every whispered agreement was a thread woven into a vast network of obligation and indebtedness. His reputation was ironclad. No contract was ever signed without a clear advantage secured. No deal forged without a fallback plan. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. He was a master of reading the fine print, of turning clauses and conditions into weapons sharper than any blade. His influence spread quietly, like a shadow creeping across the city, unnoticed until it had already swallowed entire blocks of power. Fear, in his world, was not about brute force but about uncertainty. He cultivated an atmosphere where doubts whispered louder than threats, where the mere possibility of his intervention was enough to bend the will of powerful men and women. This was a man who never needed to raise his voice. His presence alone was a message. The fear he inspired was the fear of losing control, of having carefully constructed empires crumble because they had underestimated him. He understood the economy of trust and betrayal better than most, knowing exactly when to tighten his grip and when to let a thread slip just enough to avoid suspicion. Yet, the moment we see now, a man once so untouchable, now exposed, marks a devastating reversal, one that cuts deeper than any wound inflicted by an enemy's bullet. His fall didn't come from a single blunder or an impulsive act of recklessness. Instead, it was the slow grind of financial pressure that chipped away at his resources, the relentless tightening of legal snares that boxed him in inch by inch, and the silent betrayals of those he had once considered untouchable allies. These were the true weapons against him, wielded not with malice but with cold efficiency. The irony is that his downfall underscores just how much he understood the stakes. He knew every contract's loophole, every risk's hidden cost, and every potential manipulation that could turn a profit or destroy a rival. His vulnerability now is not the result of ignorance but of a carefully measured erosion, a war of attrition waged in the shadows by forces as patient and ruthless as he once was. Watching him in this state, a man who once owned every room he entered reduced to a figure grasping for the remnants of his influence, is a stark reminder that power, no matter how absolute, can be undone by the quietest of enemies. The pen, indeed, can carve a path to ruin more effectively than the sword ever could. The bankruptcy agreement arrived like a final, unyielding verdict, a document so meticulously crafted it seemed less a legal formality and more an instrument of absolute certainty. At first glance, the papers bore every hallmark of rigor and professionalism. Crisp letterhead, authoritative seals, and signatures that carried the weight of binding commitment. The language was precise, almost surgical, leaving no room for ambiguity. It spoke in terms that brooked no dissent, effective immediately, non-negotiable deadlines, automatic penalties, and irrevocable clauses recurred with relentless insistence throughout the pages. Behind this veneer of immaculate legality lay a strategy designed to seal every conceivable exit, to turn the boss's fate into an inescapable fact. Each section was layered with phrases that implied inevitability, as if the course had been charted long ago and the only option left was compliance. Deadlines were not suggestions. They were immutable milestones, accompanied by penalties so steep and swift they functioned as legal traps. Missing a payment date wasn't just a consequence. It triggered a cascade of enforceable actions, each more draconian than the last. The language did not offer alternatives or negotiations. Instead, it framed every term as a final command, a series of dominoes already set in motion. This wasn't a document born of error or haste. It was forged with an almost ruthless precision, each clause reinforcing the next in a seamless web designed to entangle and immobilize. What struck observers with the greatest unease was how the agreement's immaculate presentation belied the chaos it represented. There was no sign of the typical rush or desperation that often accompanies such legal maneuvers. The paperwork was too perfect, too polished. Every word seemed deliberately chosen, every paragraph carefully structured to convey authority and closure. It was a masterclass in the art of legal finality, a stark contrast to the unraveling it demanded. This was not the haphazard work of a desperate party scrambling to salvage a sinking ship. Instead, it was the product of deliberate intent, a calculated move executed with cold efficiency. The legal jargon itself functioned like a series of locks, each clause a keyhole that only the architects of this agreement could navigate. There were sections referencing cross-default provisions that would activate penalties linked to unrelated agreements, ensuring that the boss's options were not only limited but actively shrinking. There were irrevocable waivers of rights, stripping away the ability to contest or appeal. The scope of liabilities was broadened until they stretched beyond what anyone might have anticipated, ensnaring not just the business but personal assets as well. The document's tone communicated not just finality, but a grim certainty. Resistance was futile. More than anything, the agreement told a story of control. It was a legal straitjacket, crafted to leave no loopholes, no backdoors, no room for negotiation. The boss, once a titan commanding armies of influence, was now confronted with a reality where the law's cold precision outmatched even his legendary cunning. The bankruptcy wasn't just a financial endpoint, it was a meticulously engineered conclusion, designed to make every attempt at escape or defiance impossible. In its immaculate formality, the paperwork whispered a chilling truth. This was not the result of incompetence or misfortune, but of design, a final chapter written by enemies who understood that true power lies in closing every door. She moved through the house like a shadow, her presence barely registering in the air. Years of routine had perfected her invisibility. The creak of floorboards under her worn slippers was the only sound to betray her passage. The maid, whose name was seldom spoken and whose face was rarely acknowledged, had become an unchanging fixture in the background of this household's unraveling fate. Her days were marked by steady, unhurried motions, dusting the same shelves, wiping the same windows, arranging the same silverware with meticulous care. No one asked her questions, and she never offered answers. In the grand hierarchy of the house, she was a ghost, a silent observer locked outside the circle of significance. Her invisibility was not accidental but a product of the rigid power structures that governed everyone beneath the roof. The family, once proud and commanding, now treated her as though she were an extension of the furniture, something necessary but unworthy of attention. It was a pattern repeated countless times in places like this, where social rank dictated who deserved notice and who did not. It was easier, after all, to overlook those who made themselves small, who never demanded to be seen. The maid understood this dynamic well. She had long ago ceased to expect recognition or respect, and in return, the household passed her by without thought, assuming her silence meant ignorance. Yet ignorance was far from the truth. She was not clever in the way that mattered to those in power. She lacked the sharp wit or the cunning that might have elevated her status. Her intelligence was quieter, woven into the fabric of her daily attentiveness. She noticed the small shifts, the way the master's hands trembled when he signed papers, the subtle tension between the siblings during breakfast, the furtive glances exchanged over closed doors. While others dismissed these signals as inconsequential, she cataloged them with patient precision. Patterns emerged to her like constellations in a night sky, disconnected points of light that, when connected, revealed stories no one else cared to decipher. Her value lay not in grand insights, but in the consistency of her watchfulness. She remembered which china had been moved, which curtains were drawn at what hours, and which whispers fell just beneath the threshold of audible conversation. In a household slipping into ruin and suspicion, her quiet observations became a silent ledger of truth. She did not speak of what she saw. Such revelations would have been ignored or ridiculed. Instead, she held the knowledge close, a secret ballast in a house tipping toward chaos. In this way, she was both the most overlooked and the most indispensable witness to the slow, inexorable collapse. The bankruptcy that had sealed the family's fate was a storm raging outside her reach. But inside, in the stillness of her presence, she gathered the fragments of a story no one else chose to hear. The power structures that dismissed her were blind to the fact that in their neglect, they had handed her a vantage point few possessed. She existed in the margins, watching the end unfold with steady eyes, knowing more than anyone cared to admit. Her fingers hovered over the worn paper, the edges curling faintly from years of handling, when something caught her eye, a tiny, almost imperceptible detail nestled between lines of text that everyone else had skimmed over. It was a date, handwritten in a cramped, hurried script, tucked just beneath the signature at the bottom of the page. Oddly, it didn't match the timeline laid out in the rest of the documents. She blinked, leaned in closer, the quiet hum of the room fading as her focus sharpened. The official reports had all pointed to the same month, July, but this date was unmistakably stamped August 3rd, as if someone had scribbled it in after the fact. Her breath caught, subtle but sharp, and she glanced around as if to check whether anyone else noticed. The room remained oblivious, voices rising and falling with practiced ease as the meeting pressed on. No one looked her way. Nobody was waiting for her to interrupt, to challenge the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. And yet, the detail gnawed at her, a small fissure in the otherwise seamless facade. She traced the ink with her fingertip, as if feeling for the intention behind the date, the reason it had been placed there. Was it a mistake, a hurried correction, or something more deliberate, a quiet insertion meant to rewrite a piece of history? Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. The inconsistency was so minor, just a single date, but in the world she had come to know, where every detail mattered, this was a thread that could unravel everything. Still, the silence in the room was a weight, pressing down with the unspoken rule that she should keep her place, that her voice was not needed here. What would happen if she spoke up? Would they dismiss her again? Laugh her off as the outsider? The one who saw shadows where there were none? Her pulse quickened with the tension of that choice. To speak was to risk isolation, to invite scrutiny she might not be ready to face. To stay silent was to let the truth slip further into the shadows, buried beneath layers of indifference and convenience. She swallowed hard, feeling the tight knot in her throat, the heavy hesitation that settled like a stone in her chest. There was something else, a subtle shift in the signature itself. The placement was unusual, slightly askew compared to the neat, consistent style of earlier documents. It was as if the signatory had hesitated, or been forced to shift the pen mid-motion. The ink bore a faint smudge, as though someone had tried to mask the imperfection, but in doing so had drawn more attention to it. It was a whisper of doubt, a crack in the polished surface that no one else had dared to examine. Her gaze flickered to the faces around the table, all fixed on the speaker, nodding as if they had already accepted the story. She was alone in this pause, this moment suspended between certainty and suspicion. The room was a stage, and she the reluctant actor caught out of script, wrestling with the urge to speak a truth that might shatter the fragile order. For a breath, she considered closing the folder, letting the detail remain buried, a secret kept in quiet defiance. But the image of her family's downfall, the invisible forces that had pulled the strings, flashed before her eyes. This small, strange date was a key, and turning it in her hands could unlock answers no one else sought. Her fingers tightened around the paper, decision crystallizing in the silence. The room was still unaware, still moving forward without her. But she was no longer willing to let the unnoticed detail slip away into the margins, where it belonged to no one but herself. That seemingly insignificant date was far from a mere clerical oversight. It was the linchpin in a calculated scheme designed to entrap her family's patriarch. On the surface, it appeared as a minor discrepancy, easily dismissed or overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. Yet, once understood in its full context, it revealed a deliberate manipulation of timing that altered the legal standing of the entire document. What was presented as an agreement, a routine acknowledgement of debt or responsibility, was in reality a cleverly disguised instrument of coercion. The date was chosen not at random but to coincide with a moment when her father's defenses were at their weakest, when external pressures had already begun to erode his ability to resist. This small detail shifted the narrative from one of unfortunate bankruptcy to one of intentional setup. The timing ensured that any attempt to challenge the document's validity would be undermined by deadlines and statutes of limitations, effectively locking him into an irreversible position. It was a trap that required his signature not out of ignorance, but because the framework around him had been meticulously constructed to make refusal seem impossible or even reckless. The legal significance of the date was that it triggered clauses that stripped away protections and imposed liabilities that had no reasonable basis, exposing him to financial ruin under the guise of due process. Moreover, the presence of this date allowed those orchestrating the downfall to manipulate the flow of information and the perception of events. By anchoring the document to that specific moment, they created a false timeline that obscured their own actions and intentions. It was a strategic move that masked their deception behind layers of legal jargon and procedural formality, ensuring that anyone reviewing the case would see only the surface story, that her father had willingly entered into an agreement that led to his collapse. But beneath that surface lay a darker truth, a premeditated plan to isolate, destabilize, and ultimately control him. The boss was not losing everything by chance or bad luck. His fate was crafted by those who understood the nuances of law and human psychology alike, using those tools to corner him into submission. The signature, often viewed as a mere formality, was in fact the final seal on a contract forged in shadows. It was the key that transformed theoretical ruin into tangible reality, binding him to terms that were never in his interest and stripping away his agency piece by piece. Without that signature, the entire structure would have crumbled. With it, the trap snapped shut irrevocably. In this light, the date ceased to be a trivial footnote and became the pivotal element that unraveled the entire facade. It exposed the intentional deception, the calculated timing, and the exploitation of trust that had gone unnoticed for too long. The realization brought clarity and purpose. This was not a story of defeat but of manipulation. A dark game played with precise moves to force a surrender that looked voluntary but was anything but. Understanding this detail was the first step in reclaiming the narrative, in seeing the true architects of the downfall and preparing to confront the shadows that had long dictated their family's fate. The contract lay on the polished mahogany desk, deceptively simple in its appearance, yet laden with clauses that whispered a sinister agenda beneath the surface. To the untrained eye, it was a routine agreement, a standard restructuring document designed to optimize business operations. But for those who had begun to see through the carefully constructed veil, it was a blueprint for betrayal, a legal mechanism designed not to advance the company's interests, but to dismantle its leadership from within. This was not a matter of open hostility or dramatic confrontations. It was a calculated administrative coup. The real crime hid in the fine print, in the silent provisions that transferred control of critical assets without alerting the rightful owner. It was a form of shadow warfare, where the battlefield was corporate governance and the weapons were signatures and notarized seals. The perpetrators understood that the most effective crimes today were no longer about brute force or visible violence. They were about invisibility and legitimacy, crimes camouflaged as lawful acts. Within the contract, a series of clauses had been inserted, each one meticulously designed to erode the boss's power incrementally. The first step was the silent transfer of company shares to an obscure holding entity, one whose true beneficiaries were hidden behind layers of shell corporations. This transfer was not announced in the board meetings nor disclosed in the usual financial reports. Instead, it was buried in annexes and amendments, buried so deep that only a forensic audit could uncover it. By the time the boss realized the shift, the controlling interest had already slipped from their grasp. Simultaneously, the contract established new financial protocols that funneled company revenue through a network of offshore accounts. Ostensibly, this was framed as a tax optimization strategy, but in reality, it served as a laundering mechanism, siphoning funds out of reach and into the pockets of those orchestrating the betrayal. The layers of transactions created an illusion of compliance and transparency, satisfying auditors and regulators while masking the true flow of capital. This was the hallmark of shadow crimes. The offense was legal on the surface but criminal in its intent and effect. Perhaps most insidiously, the contract included clauses that gradually removed the boss's authority over key decisions. Appointment powers were shifted to committees populated by loyalists of the conspirators, while veto rights and budget controls were quietly rescinded. These administrative changes were subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion but profound enough to cripple leadership. The boss found themselves increasingly sidelined, their role reduced to a figurehead with diminishing influence. What made this scheme devastating was its patience and patience alone. There was no need for confrontation or upheaval. The betrayal unfolded like a slow poison, seeping into the company's fabric unnoticed until it was too late to reverse. Every action was legal, every signature valid, every decision documented. The law had become the instrument of their undoing, a weapon wielded by those who knew how to manipulate its intricacies to their advantage. This form of treachery was a stark reminder that the most effective crimes today did not rely on force or intimidation but on the mastery of legal and financial systems. It was a game where the rules were rewritten in whispers and footnotes, where loyalty was a facade and trust a vulnerability. The boss's downfall was not a sudden collapse but a meticulously engineered surrender, a slow unraveling orchestrated from within the very structures designed to protect them. Understanding this was crucial, not just to identify the enemy but to begin reclaiming control. The fight now was not against visible foes but against invisible currents, against contracts and clauses that masked malice as legality. The path forward demanded not only courage but also a deep understanding of the shadows cast by the law itself, and the resolve to bring light to the hidden betrayals lurking inside the paperwork. The lawyers, accountants, and advisors involved had been navigating the same documents for weeks, their eyes trained to detect irregularities only within the boundaries of their specialized knowledge. Yet, the very expertise that should have been their greatest asset became a prison, blinding them to what was plainly there. Their routine had ossified into a series of mechanical checks, cross-referencing figures, verifying signatures, confirming compliance, without ever questioning the deeper intent behind the paperwork. This kind of mechanical diligence breeds a false sense of security. They trusted the system, the protocols, and each other too much, assuming that what appeared normal truly was. Arrogance, though subtle, crept in, the belief that their education and experience alone insulated them from error or oversight. Pressure compounded this blindness. Deadlines loomed, demanding swift conclusions that left little room for reflection or skepticism. Each professional was caught in a web of competing interests and expectations, which often discouraged challenging the status quo. After all, questioning the documents too deeply could delay proceedings, jeopardize client relationships, or expose uncomfortable truths that nobody wanted to confront. The risk of conflict between professional duty and personal gain, between loyalty to clients and moral responsibility, created an invisible barrier to genuine scrutiny. Many preferred the comfort of plausible deniability, convinced that the complexity of legalese and accounting jargon would protect them from the consequences of missing a single detail. In this environment, expertise mutated into blindness. The professionals mistook familiarity for understanding, mistaking the familiar forms and phrases as proof of legitimacy rather than potential camouflage. Their authority made them less inclined to doubt. After all, who would question the work of those deemed experts? This created a dangerous echo chamber where assumptions were reinforced rather than challenged. The result was a collective failure to see what was hidden in plain sight, a detail so subtle it required stepping outside the conventional frameworks to perceive. Meanwhile, the maid, unburdened by authority or specialized knowledge, approached the situation differently. Without deadlines or professional pressures, she had no reason to rush or overlook anything. Her perspective was grounded in observation rather than interpretation. She noticed the small, incongruous things, the misplaced papers, the unusual patterns in the stacks of files, the odd timing of certain events, that eluded the experts because they were not trained to see beyond the text. Her lack of assumptions acted as a lens of clarity, allowing her to sense the abnormal beneath the surface of the normal. Her position also meant she was free from conflicts of interest. She had no stake in preserving reputations or protecting clients, no fear of professional repercussions if she voiced doubts. This impartiality gave her the courage to question what everyone else accepted without hesitation. The maid's fresh eyes were the key to unlocking truths the professionals had missed. A reminder that insight often comes not from authority or expertise, but from curiosity and a willingness to see the world as it is, not as it's supposed to be. In the intricate dance of power and deception, it was not the learned but the observant who first glimpsed the shadow lurking within the paperwork. The professional's failure was not merely a mistake. It was a lesson in humility, a stark warning that mastery of one domain can blind you to its darkest corners. Only by embracing doubt and stepping outside entrenched roles could the true nature of the betrayal be revealed and addressed. At 9 a.m., the room held its breath. The pen hovered just above the paper, suspended in a moment that stretched beyond time itself. The boss's eyes flickered between the signature line and the faces gathered silently around the table. The weight of the decision pressed down, yet no stroke marked the page. The stillness was a fracture in reality, a hinge on which two worlds balanced precariously. In one reality, the pen finally descended, the ink seeping into the fibers, sealing the fate so carefully constructed by the betrayers. The signature, though unseen by the naked eye in this paused moment, would become the catalyst for ruin. The trap, so meticulously crafted, would snap shut with undeniable finality. The boss's empire, built on years of calculated decisions, would crumble overnight. Allies would vanish, creditors would circle, and the law would close in, exploiting every loophole that the betrayed had failed to foresee. The signature would be the death knell of his reign, a document that turned trusted partners into enemies, a paper that transformed power into ashes. But in the other reality, the pen stayed suspended. The boss's mind raced, the brief hesitation opening a window of clarity. A subtle doubt, a fleeting instinct, nudged him away from the act that would have ended everything. The silence was shattered not by ink, but by a sudden realization. The trap, though nearly complete, had cracks, small, almost imperceptible weaknesses that only the sharpest eyes could detect. The boss, no longer blinded by arrogance or haste, saw the outlines of deception etched in the fine print, in the unnatural cadence of the contract's clauses. This pause allowed the boss to withdraw, to step back and call for a second opinion, to bring in the observant who had first glimpsed the shadows lurking within the paperwork. Together, they unraveled the threads of betrayal with painstaking care, exposing the architects of the scheme before the final collapse could take root. The trap, designed to destroy, instead crumbled under scrutiny, leaving the would-be betrayers exposed and vulnerable. In this fractured moment, two futures diverged. One led to utter loss, to a kingdom reduced to rubble by a signature that never truly belonged to the boss's intent. The other led to survival, to a hard-fought preservation of power, not through ignorance but through vigilance and the courage to question certainty. The room remained silent, the pen still poised. The decision was not simply about ink on paper but about the resilience of trust and the fragile nature of control. A single hesitation, a breath held in the balance, had rewritten the course of destiny. The signature that never touched the paper became a symbol, not of failure or capitulation, but of the power held in moments of doubt, the strength found in pausing before the fall. Power is a curious thing. It often thrives in broad daylight, commanding attention with loud declarations, sweeping decisions, and grand gestures. Yet, the most dangerous wielders of power are those who never pause to notice who is watching. They move confidently, assuming their authority is absolute, unchallenged, and invisible to the quiet observers lurking in the shadows. The boss nearly lost everything, not because he lacked strength or cunning, but because he trusted systems and procedures over genuine scrutiny. His downfall was almost scripted by the very frameworks he relied on, trusting paperwork and automated safeguards instead of the sharp eyes and relentless questions that quietly compile the truth. In this world, silence is a weapon, and the mundane becomes deadly. The absence of noise does not mean the absence of action. It is in the quiet corners and unnoticed details where empires crumble. The boss's hesitation, the single breath held before signing, was more than a moment of indecision. It was a refusal to surrender control blindly to faceless bureaucracy. That hesitation preserved him, reminding us that power is never absolute when attention is applied. It's not the loudest voice or the boldest claim that secures a legacy. It's the vigilance to observe, question, and intervene before the damage becomes irreversible. This story is a testament to the invisible guardians of truth, the watchers who understand that power doesn't always see who's watching. It's a warning that in today's world, the greatest threats often emerge not in the chaos of the streets, but in the quiet corridors of offices, boardrooms, and behind closed doors. The real crimes happen in the details. The overlooked line in a contract, the unchecked number in a ledger, the silent nod that authorizes destruction. Recognizing this is crucial because it means power can be challenged not only by force but by attention. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe modern crimes happen more in offices than on the streets? Share your perspective below. Your voice is part of this silent watch. If you want to uncover more stories where silence and paperwork destroy empires, subscribe to Shadow Crimes. Stay tuned for the next video, where another invisible detail will change everything once again. Remember this, in the end, it wasn't power that saved him, it was attention.